There is a place, the ancient Greeks believed, that exists beneath everything, beneath the soil, beneath the stone, beneath the roots of every mountain and the bed of every river. A vast and silent kingdom, stretching endlessly in every direction, lit not by the sun but by the pale, cold glow of something older, something permanent. They called it the Underworld. And over all of it, over every shadow and every soul that ever slipped from the world of the living, there ruled a god of extraordinary and often misunderstood power. His name was Hades. We speak his name today with a certain instinct toward unease, as if the word itself carries weight, and perhaps that is fitting. For the ancient Greeks, to say his name aloud at all was considered something of a risk. Many avoided it entirely, preferring softer titles instead: Pluton, meaning the rich one; Klymenos, the renowned; Eubuleus, the good counselor. These were not merely poetic nicknames. They were careful, deliberate ways of speaking of a god whose domain touched every single living thing, and who, in the end, would claim every single one of them. And yet Hades was not what we might today imagine when we picture a god of death. He was not a villain. He was not a monster lurking in the dark. He was something far more complex, far more measured, and in many ways far more interesting than that. He was a sovereign, a judge, a keeper of balance, in a cosmos ruled by gods of considerable ego and caprice, gods who transformed their enemies into animals, started wars over vanity, and rewrote the fates of mortals on a whim. Hades was remarkably fair. His realm operated on a principle that no other part of the ancient Greek world could quite claim: equality. The pauper and the king arrived at his gates the same way, stripped of wealth and title, carrying nothing but the life they had lived. His origin is as grand as it is sobering. He was one of the original 6 Olympian children of the Titans, Cronus and Rhea, siblings to Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, born into a family of gods who were themselves swallowed whole by their father the moment they entered the world. Hades spent the earliest ages of existence imprisoned in the stomach of Cronus, waiting in absolute darkness. As if, even before his story truly began, the void had already claimed him. When at last Zeus freed his siblings, and the great war against the Titans was won, the 3 brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, drew lots to divide the cosmos between them. Zeus received the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades received the world beneath. Whether by fortune or by fate, the darkest realm became his. He descended into it, and never truly left, making him the only major Olympian god who did not dwell upon Olympus. This separation from the divine court above was not a punishment, it was a responsibility. Someone had to govern the dead, and Hades did so with the full weight and dignity of a king. His palace was said to be magnificent, built of dark stone draped in silence, and furnished with all the terrible grandeur of a court that ruled not dozens or hundreds, but every soul that had ever lived. His power, when examined carefully, was staggering. He commanded the helm of darkness, a cap of invisibility so complete that even the gods of Olympus could not perceive its wearer. He held dominion over the earth's hidden treasures, all the gold and silver and precious stone buried beneath the surface, which is why his Roman name, Pluto, has given us the word we still use for extraordinary wealth. His queen, Persephone, ruled beside him, a goddess of such importance that her annual return to the surface world was believed to cause spring itself, and her descent back to the underworld to bring on winter. The seasons, then, were partly his. The fertility of the earth was partly his. The very rhythm of the living world above was governed in quiet ways from below. He was not the god of death itself. That was Thanatos. Hades was something greater. He was the god of what comes after. In the hours ahead, we will descend with him, carefully, unhurriedly, into the full story of who Hades was, what his kingdom looked like, how souls were judged and where they were sent, what myths grew around him, and why his legacy has endured for thousands of years, shaping art and literature and our deepest instincts about what waits for us when our time in the sunlight ends. We will explore the rivers of the underworld, the judges at the gate, the heroes who dared to visit and return, and the strange, quiet dignity of a god who asked for very little and received, in time, absolutely everything. Take your time. There is no rush here. The dead, after all, are never going anywhere. There is a moment, in nearly every ancient Greek account of the underworld, where the traveler, where the hero, poet, or wandering soul arrives at a river. Not a river like the ones they knew in life, fed by rain and mountain snow, running clear and cold over smooth stone. This river is different. It is dark. It is wide, and it marks the border between everything that is living and everything that is not. To stand at its edge is to understand, perhaps for the first time, that you are no longer in the world you came from. You are somewhere else entirely. You are in the kingdom of Hades. The ancient Greeks were remarkable architects of the imagination, and nowhere is that more evident than in the way they constructed the underworld. This was not a vague, shapeless void, not simply darkness without dimension. It was a fully realized place, with geography and borders, rivers with names and properties, distinct regions serving different purposes, and a structure of judgment and order that governed the fate of every soul who entered. Hades did not merely rule over a shadow, he ruled over a civilization of the dead, and it was organized with the same deliberate care that any great kingdom would demand. To understand his domain, it helps to begin at the beginning, or rather, at the edge. The underworld was believed to lie at the outermost boundary of the known world, and also directly beneath it. These two ideas coexisted in Greek cosmology without contradiction, as so many things did in that tradition. In some accounts, a soul arriving at the underworld would first cross a great grey plain, a liminal stretch of nothing in particular, before reaching what would become the defining feature of Hades's kingdom, its rivers. There were 5 of them, each one a god in its own right, each one possessing a character as distinct as any deity on Olympus. The most famous was the Styx, the river of hatred, or in some translations, the river of unbreakable oath. The Styx was not merely a geographical boundary, it was the most sacred thing in the Greek cosmos. When the gods themselves swore by the Styx, that oath could not be broken, not by Zeus, not by anyone. Its waters were said to be dark and cold and utterly still, and it wound 9 times around the underworld, encircling the entire realm like a great slow coil. It was across the Styx, or in some traditions, across its companion river, the Acheron, that the newly dead were ferried by a figure as ancient and recognizable as Hades himself, Charon, the boatman. Charon is one of those figures from antiquity who has lost none of his power in the thousands of years since he was first imagined. He is old, impossibly, terribly old, with a beard like knotted rope and eyes that burn beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He poles his flat-bottomed boat across the water in silence, and he asks only one thing in return for passage: payment. A coin placed in the mouth or on the eyes of the dead by those who loved them before burial. This was not merely mythology, it was practice. Across the ancient Greek world, the dead were buried with coins, an obol, most commonly, because the living understood that to arrive at Charon's shore without one was to be refused, to be turned away, to wander the near bank of the river for 100 years, untethered and unresolved, before passage was finally granted. The very act of proper burial, then, was a mercy. a gift from the living to the dead. But the Styx was only one of 5 rivers, and each of the others shaped the experience of the underworld in its own way. The Lethe was the river of forgetfulness. Souls who drank from its waters forgot everything: their name, their life, their loves, their grief, their joy. All of it dissolved like salt in water. For many souls, this was considered a kindness rather than a loss, because what is suffering without the memory of it? The Lethe was the river of release, of peaceful erasure, of beginning again without the weight of everything that came before. Opposite to it, in spirit if not always in geography, was the Mnemosyne, the river of memory. This one was less universally traversed. It belonged particularly to those being initiated into certain mystery cults, or to souls destined for a higher fate, who needed to remember who they were in order to carry something forward. The tension between Lethe and Mnemosyne, between forgetting and remembering, is one of the most quietly profound ideas the Greeks ever embedded in their mythology. Even in death, they seem to ask, what do we choose to hold on to? Then there was the Phlegethon, the river of fire, which flowed not with water but with flame. It burned without consuming, ran without cooling, and surrounded the deepest and most terrible region of the underworld, Tartarus. In some accounts, it was a river of punishment, its fire reserved for those whose crimes in life had earned them something worse than mere death. In others, it was simply elemental, a feature of the underworld's physical architecture. The way a volcano is a feature of the living world. Either way, it burned, eternal and indifferent. And finally, the Cocytus, the river of lamentation, the river that received the tears of the dead. It ran narrow and sorrowful along the margins of the underworld, and its sound, if one could hear it, was said to be a low and endless weeping. Not dramatic, not violent, just a quiet, constant sound of grief finding its outlet, as grief always must. Beyond the rivers lay the gates, and at the gates, one of the most immediately recognizable figures in all of Greek mythology. Cerberus was the hound of Hades, and he was unlike any dog the world above had ever produced. He stood enormous at the threshold of the underworld. 3-headed, in the most common tellings, though some accounts gave him as many as 50, and others added the detail of a serpent for a tail and snakes erupting from his back like a mane of living things. He was not there to keep souls out. He was there to keep them in. Souls could enter the underworld without difficulty. It was leaving that Cerberus would not permit. He was, in this way, a perfect guardian for a kingdom that operated on absolute permanence. You may come in, his 3 sets of teeth seemed to say, but you may never leave. Past the gate, the soul enters the underworld proper, and here the geography becomes something more like a moral landscape, a place where the terrain itself reflects the life one has lived. The first stop, for most souls, was the judges. There were 3 of them: Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus, all 3 former kings of the mortal world, chosen for their wisdom and their fairness in life, and elevated in death to the highest judicial office the afterlife offered. They sat at the crossroads of the dead, a place where the path split in 3 directions, and they reviewed the soul before them, not with evidence presented by lawyers or witnesses, not with documents or testimony. They saw the life itself, every choice, every act of kindness and every cruelty, every moment of courage and every cowardice, everything. And then they decided. The path to the left led toward Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, a place so far below the surface that an anvil dropped from the earth would fall for 9 days before striking its floor. Tartarus was reserved not for ordinary sinners, but for the genuinely monstrous, for those who had committed crimes against the gods or against the fundamental order of the cosmos. Here you find the figures whose punishments became legends. Tantalus, who murdered his own son and served the flesh to the gods; forever reaching for fruit and water that pull away at the moment of his grasp. Sisyphus, who cheated death itself twice through cunning and was condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, watching it roll back down each time he neared the summit. Ixion, bound to a spinning wheel of fire. These were not random punishments. They were fitted, sometimes with grim precision, to the nature of the crime. The path to the right led toward Elysium, the fields of the blessed, the ancient Greek equivalent of paradise. This was a place of extraordinary beauty, of warm light and green fields and an ease of being that the living world could only approximate on its very finest days. Here the genuinely virtuous came to rest. Here the great heroes spent eternity in a happiness so complete it needed no further definition. Some accounts describe a tier beyond Elysium called the Isles of the Blessed, for those who had achieved Elysium 3 times across 3 separate lifetimes, a kind of ultimate reward reserved for the rarest of souls. And the path that went straight ahead, the path that most souls would walk, led to the fields of Asphodel. The fields of Asphodel are perhaps the most quietly fascinating region of the entire underworld, precisely because they represent not reward and not punishment, but simply continuation. Most people in the Greek view were neither wicked enough for Tartarus nor virtuous enough for Elysium. They were ordinary. They had lived mixed lives, as most lives are mixed, with kindness and selfishness, with moments of bravery and moments of smallness, with love given and withheld, with promises kept and promises broken. They were, in short, human, and so they came to Asphodel. The asphodel plant itself was a pale grey-white flower that bloomed in dry and barren places, neither beautiful nor ugly, simply persistent. The fields of it stretched across the middle ground of the underworld, and here the souls wandered, dimly aware, living a kind of faded echo of the life they had known. Not in pain, in most accounts, not in joy, simply in existence. A long, quiet, twilight continuation that matched the grey neutrality of a life neither greatly good nor greatly bad. Presiding over all of this, the rivers, the judges, the plains, and the pit, and the paradise, was Hades himself. He sat in his great palace at the center of the underworld, and from there he administered a kingdom that never stopped growing, never stopped receiving, and never once declined to accept what the world above sent down. He was not cruel in his governance. He was not capricious. He was consistent. He was present. He was, by every account that survives, a king who took his responsibilities seriously in a way that many of the gods above him simply did not. He had helpers, of course. The Furies, the Erinyes, served as his enforcers, pursuing those who broke oaths and committed crimes against family, bringing them to justice with a relentlessness that no mortal authority could match. Hypnos, the god of sleep, lived in the underworld and was Hades' quiet neighbor, twin brother to Thanatos, the god of death, both of them dwelling in the dark and doing what they did gently if they could. Even Hecate, goddess of the crossroads and of magic, moved through the underworld's margins, torchlit and watchful. This was not a simple place. It was not a metaphor dressed up as a location. It was a complete world, imagined with the same attention to detail that Homer gave to Troy, that Hesiod gave to Olympus, that the Greeks gave to everything they truly cared about, understanding, because they did care. They cared deeply about what happened after death. They wanted the underworld to make sense, to be fair, to be ordered, to be governed by someone capable. And in Hades, they believed they had exactly that. A god who did not seek war, did not meddle in the affairs of mortals for sport, did not chase lovers across the sky, or turn rivals into trees. A god who simply waited, who received, who held the weight of all the dead in his vast and permanent kingdom, and who kept them, and who ensured that nothing was lost, and nothing was forgotten, and nothing went unjudged. There is something almost peaceful in that. when you sit with it long enough. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to those who are powerful and misunderstood in equal measure. It is not the loneliness of the outcast, who has nothing and knows it. It is something quieter and stranger. The loneliness of a figure who stands at the center of everything, who is essential to the functioning of the world, who carries responsibilities that no one else could bear, and who is nonetheless avoided, spoken of in whispers, left off invitation lists, given a wide berth by those who should, by any reasonable measure, know him better. This was the loneliness of Hades. He was one of the most powerful beings in the Greek cosmos. He was a son of Titans, a brother to the king of the gods, a ruler of a domain that dwarfed in population anything Zeus or Poseidon commanded. And yet he was the god that mortals least wanted to think about, the god that other gods least wanted to visit, and the god whose name many people preferred not to say aloud at all. He was not hated, exactly. He was avoided. And there is a difference, though it may not have felt like one from where he sat, deep in his palace beneath the earth, presiding over the endless, silent arrival of the dead. To understand Hades fully, not merely as an administrator of the afterlife, not merely as the lord of a geography we have already explored, but as a personality, as a character, as something approaching a person. We have to look carefully at what the myths actually tell us about him, and what they tell us, when read without the overlay of later tradition and the long shadow of Christian conceptions of hell and its ruler, is genuinely surprising. He was not evil. This point cannot be made firmly enough, because centuries of artistic tradition have layered onto Hades all the iconography of villainy, until the original is barely visible beneath it. He was not a deceiver. He did not corrupt souls or delight in suffering. He issued no temptations. He made no bargains designed to ensnare the unwary. He was not, in any meaningful sense, the Greek equivalent of Satan, a comparison that gets made casually and frequently, and that is almost entirely wrong. He was stern. He was serious. He was implacable once a decision was made, because the nature of his kingdom demanded permanence, and he had no patience for those who tried to circumvent it. But sternness is not cruelty. Seriousness is not malice. And the gods of Olympus, who were genuinely capricious, who genuinely did harm mortals for sport, who genuinely destroyed individuals out of wounded pride or petty jealousy, were in many ways far less morally admirable than the god they preferred not to visit. There is an account, referenced across multiple ancient sources, of Hades sitting in his throne room and weeping. The occasion was the music of Orpheus, the great musician who descended into the underworld to retrieve his dead wife, Eurydice. Orpheus played his lyre as he traveled through the kingdom of the dead, and the music was so extraordinary, so heartbreakingly beautiful, that it moved everything it touched. The Furies stopped their work and wept. Tantalus forgot, for a moment, to reach for the fruit. Sisyphus sat down on his boulder and listened. And Hades, the immovable, the permanent, the god of absolute endings, wept, and agreed to release Eurydice. He was moved. He felt. He responded to beauty and to love, with something recognizably like compassion. The story of Orpheus is often told as a tragedy about looking back, about the fatal moment when Orpheus turned to check on Eurydice and lost her a second time. But inside that tragedy is a smaller and often overlooked story about a god who was not supposed to feel anything, and did. He was just. This is perhaps his most frequently cited quality. In a pantheon filled with gods who played favorites, who lifted up those who flattered them and crushed those who did not, Hades administered his realm with a consistency that was almost Roman in its orderliness. The judges he employed, Minos, Rhadamanthus, Aeacus, were not his puppets. They were genuinely independent arbiters, and their verdicts appear in the surviving mythology without meaningful interference from Hades himself. He built a system, and he trusted it. That is the act of a ruler, confident enough in his own sense of justice to step back from the individual decision and let the system function. He was reluctant to give things up. This quality read, to mortals, as fearsome possessiveness. Hades almost never willingly released a soul from his kingdom. The handful of exceptions, Eurydice, Alcestis, Sisyphus, in his cunning escape, are remarkable precisely because they are exceptions. Some scholars have read this, not as cruelty, but as a form of cosmic responsibility. If Hades released souls freely, the boundary between life and death would dissolve. The order that made the world function, the cycle of mortal life, of agriculture, of seasons, of meaning itself, depended on death being permanent. He held that line not because he was heartless, but because someone had to. And then there is the matter of Persephone. It is the story most closely associated with Hades after the Underworld itself, and it is the story that reveals more about his inner life than any other. The surface version is well known. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, young and radiant and beloved by her mother beyond almost any other love in the Greek cosmos, was gathering flowers in a meadow when the earth opened and Hades appeared and took her. He brought her to the underworld and made her his queen. Demeter, devastated and furious, withdrew her gifts from the world. The crops failed. The earth went cold. People began to starve. Eventually Zeus intervened, and a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld with Hades, and part of the year above with her mother. When she descended, winter came. When she returned, spring followed. But a slower reading reveals something more complicated, and it begins with Persephone herself. As the tradition develops and deepens, she becomes something more than a myth subject. A queen of remarkable authority, feared and respected throughout the underworld, exercising independent judgment, capable of compassion and of terrible firmness in equal measure. She was not a decoration on Hades' throne. She was a co-ruler, and the underworld was hers as much as his. And Hades, this is the detail worth sitting with, was by all ancient accounts devoted to her. There are almost no myths of Hades taking lovers, no catalogue of affairs and conquests of the kind that fill the mythology of Zeus or Poseidon. He was, for a Greek god, extraordinarily faithful. He gave Persephone the underworld, not as a cage, as a kingdom. He shared it with her completely. There is something in that, in the image of this most solitary, most avoided of gods finding in Persephone both a companion and an equal. That adds a dimension to Hades the myths do not always make explicit, but that sits underneath everything. The weeping at Orpheus's music, the reluctant agreement to release Eurydice, a god who understood grief and loss and love and longing because he had felt all of those things himself. He also had a body of worship that is, in its own quiet way, remarkable. Hades was not widely worshipped with temples in every city and festivals on the calendar. His sanctuaries tended to be underground, or at the mouths of caves, or at places where the earth opened and the smell of sulfur suggested something deeper was breathing beneath. Worshippers who visited these sites often averted their eyes and struck the ground rather than raising their hands to the sky. The rituals were nocturnal. The animals sacrificed were black, but worship him they did, particularly in places connected to agriculture. Farmers understood, in a way that city dwellers perhaps did not, that death and growth were not opposites, that the seed buried in the earth and the body buried in the earth were performing the same essential transformation, that decay fed the soil and the soil fed life, and life eventually fed the earth again. Hades was the one who received the dead, yes, but he was also the one who held the ground through which the wheat pushed in spring. He was wealthy because beneath his feet lay everything, the minerals, the ores, the richness of the dark earth that made agriculture possible. He was not simply a god of endings. He was a god of what the earth holds and what it releases, a figure of transformation as much as of finality. This is the portrait that emerges when you look at Hades without rushing, not the villain, not the shadow lord of some ancient nightmare, but a figure of immense weight and quiet dignity, serious where others were playful, faithful where others were faithless, consistent where others were erratic. A god who lived in the dark because the dark was where he was needed, and who did what was required of him without complaint and without fanfare, for as long as the world existed, which was, by definition, forever. There is a word in ancient Greek that has no clean equivalent in English, and yet it names one of the most enduring narrative traditions in all of human storytelling. The word is katabasis. It means, literally, a going down, a descent, and in the mythological imagination of the ancient world, it referred specifically to the act of traveling into the underworld while still alive, entering the kingdom of the dead as a breathing, feeling, fully conscious mortal, and, in the most remarkable cases, returning from it. It was considered the most dangerous thing a person could do, more dangerous than war, more dangerous than sailing unknown seas or facing monsters or angering gods, because all of those dangers, however terrible, existed within the world of the living. The katabasis took you somewhere else entirely, somewhere the rules of the living world did not apply, somewhere the most fundamental boundary in existence had to be crossed, and where the lord of that boundary had every reason and every right to keep you. And yet they went, hero after hero, across centuries of Greek mythology, descended into the underworld. They went for different reasons and with different preparations, and they returned. Those who returned changed in ways that no other experience could have produced. Their stories together form something larger than any individual myth. They form a meditation on what it means to confront death directly, to look at it clearly without flinching, and to carry something back from that confrontation into the life above. Orpheus, son of the muse Calliope and the god Apollo, or in some traditions a mortal of extraordinary gift, was the greatest musician the world had ever produced. When he played his lyre, rivers stopped moving to listen, trees uprooted themselves and walked closer. Wild animals lay down beside each other in the grass, their violence forgotten. He had a wife named Eurydice, and she died young, taken by a serpent's bite. The grief that followed was the kind that does not organize itself into manageable portions. It was total. It remade him. And instead of accepting what every mortal must accept, Orpheus made a decision that separated him from every other grieving person who had ever lived. He picked up his lyre and walked toward the underworld. He passed Cerberus, who lay down at the music. He crossed the rivers. He moved through the fields of asphodel where the wandering dead stopped wandering and simply listened. He arrived at the palace of Hades and Persephone, and he played. Whatever he played, it carried within it the full weight of his grief. Not grief performed for an audience, but grief in its rawest and most honest form. The grief of a person who has lost the specific person without whom the world makes no sense. And it worked. Even Hades wept. And Hades agreed Eurydice could return with Orpheus to the living world on one condition. He must walk ahead of her out of the underworld, and he must not look back until they had both crossed into the light. He turned back. Of course, he turned back. The reasons why are debated endlessly. Doubt, love, the unbearable uncertainty of leading someone you cannot see, the human impossibility of trusting completely in what you cannot verify. He turned, and Eurydice dissolved back into shadow, and he was left alone at the threshold between the two worlds with nothing but his music and his loss. What is remarkable, in the context of Hades' character, is not that the condition was imposed. It is that the permission was granted at all. Hades bent his most absolute rule for a poet, not for a warrior, not for a king, for someone who made beautiful things and loved deeply. Heracles descended into the underworld as the 12th and final of his famous labors. The task was simple in its statement and nearly impossible in its execution. Go to the underworld and bring back Cerberus, alive, without weapons. He descended via an entrance at Taenarum, on the southern tip of the Peloponnese, and moved through the kingdom of the dead with the kind of energy that must have been deeply unusual in a realm accustomed to the shuffling quiet of the newly dead. He found Theseus trapped and managed to free him. And then he went to Hades himself and asked, directly and respectfully, for permission to borrow Cerberus. This is the detail most often glossed over in retellings, he asked. He did not simply take, he stood before the king of the underworld and made his request, and Hades agreed, on the condition that Heracles use no weapons, and returned the hound when the labor was done. Heracles wrestled Cerberus into submission, using only his hands, completed his task above, and then brought Cerberus back. He kept his word to Hades, and Hades accepted the return of his guardian without drama. Two figures who understood a bargain, honoring it completely. The story of Theseus and Pirithous offers a different kind of lesson, and it begins with the most ill-conceived plan in the entire tradition of the Catabasis. Pirithous was a king of the Lapiths, a close friend of Theseus, and a man whose confidence in his own abilities had curdled over time into something closer to recklessness. He decided he wanted to marry Persephone, queen of the underworld, wife of Hades, and persuaded Theseus to accompany him on this errand. They descended together. When Hades asked what had brought them to his kingdom, Pirithous explained that he had come to take Persephone as his bride. The response was almost calm. Hades invited them to sit, and they sat, and found they could not rise. They were held there, not by chains, not by violence, but by the nature of the underworld itself, as if the ground had simply decided to keep them. When Heracles eventually arrived and freed Theseus, Theseus rose and left. But when Heracles attempted to free Pirithous, the earth shook, a warning or a refusal, and Pirithous remained. He had come to steal the wife of Hades. He would stay. There was no rage in this punishment, no dramatic sentencing, just a chair, and permanence, and the quiet understanding that some things have prices attached to them that cannot be talked down or fought through. Perhaps the most philosophically rich of all the descents into the underworld belongs to Odysseus. And what makes his descent unusual is that he did not go all the way in. In the 11th book of Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the edge of the underworld at the instruction of the witch Circe, who tells him he must consult the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias in order to learn how to find his way home to Ithaca. He does not cross the rivers. He does not enter the kingdom fully. Instead, he digs a pit at the threshold, pours offerings into it, and waits. And the dead come to him. They crowd the pit, pressing toward the blood, because blood is warmth, and warmth is briefly life, and life is what they miss above all things. What follows is one of the most extraordinary passages in all of ancient literature. Odysseus speaks with the prophet Tiresias, who gives him the guidance he needs. He speaks with his mother, who died while he was away at war, and when he tries to embrace her, she slips through his arms like smoke, not out of cruelty, but because the dead simply no longer have the substance that would allow it. He speaks with Achilles, who tells him not to speak of death as something bearable, that he would rather be a poor man's servant on earth than king over all the dead. It is one of the bluntest, most honest lines in Greek mythology, spoken by the greatest warrior who ever lived, and it says something deeply human about what glory is worth when the sun is no longer something you can feel. Taken together, these descents form a pattern worth stepping back to notice. Every hero who made the Catabasis successfully did so through a combination of preparation, respect, and purpose. Orpheus had music and genuine grief. Heracles had permission, strength, and the discipline to honor his agreement. Odysseus had divine instruction and proper ritual. The ones who failed were punished, not because the underworld was hostile, but because they came with something the underworld would not accommodate: arrogance, the belief that its rules did not apply to them. Hades, in each of these stories, is not the obstacle. He is the standard. He represents the thing that is real, the thing that cannot be flattered or deceived or outmuscled for long. You can visit death, these stories seem to say. You can descend and look at it, and even, on rare occasions, carry something back from the confrontation. But you cannot own it. You cannot take from it what is not yours to take. You can only go and look and return changed, if you are fortunate enough to return at all. There is a difference between a myth and a belief. A myth is a story, a shaped, structured, narratively satisfying account of something that cannot be directly observed or verified. A belief is something else. It is what you carry with you when the story is finished, when the festival is over, when the torches have been put out, and you walk home in the dark and find yourself alone with the question that no civilization in human history has ever been able to fully answer. What actually happens when we die? The ancient Greeks had myths in abundance. They also had beliefs, and the place where those two things intersected most profoundly, where story became genuine spiritual conviction, where the mythology of Hades stopped being narrative entertainment and became something people organized their inner lives around, was in the mystery traditions, the secret religious rites that flourished across the ancient Greek world for over 1,000 years, drawing initiates from every level of society, from farmers to emperors, promising them something that ordinary religion could not just a story about death, but a genuine transformation of their relationship to it. The most important of all the mystery traditions was centered at a small town on the road between Athens and the sea. The town was called Eleusis, and the rites practiced there, the Eleusinian mysteries, were among the most significant religious institutions of the ancient world for nearly 2,000 years, from roughly the 15th century BCE until the Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered them suppressed in 392 CE. For all of that time, initiates gathered at Eleusis in September underwent a period of preparation, fasting, and ritual purification, and then participated in a ceremony whose central revelation was so carefully guarded that we do not know with complete certainty what it was. The participants, who numbered in the tens of thousands across the centuries, included some of the most articulate and intellectually accomplished people in the ancient world. Plato was almost certainly initiated, Sophocles, Marcus Aurelius, Cicero, who wrote that Athens had given the world many great gifts, but none greater than the Eleusinian mysteries, which had taught humanity not merely how to live, but how to die with genuine equanimity, and yet none of them wrote down what they saw. The oath of secrecy held across centuries and across empires with a consistency that is itself remarkable. The Eleusinian mysteries were built upon the myth of Demeter and Persephone. At Eleusis, this myth was not merely recited, it was enacted. The initiates participated in a ritual journey that followed the emotional arc of Demeter's search, the grief, the searching, the loss, and eventually the reunion, the return, the restoration. By living through the myth, rather than merely hearing it, the initiates were meant to experience something that could not be transmitted through words alone, and what they came away with, by every account that survives without betraying specifics, was an altered relationship to death. Not the elimination of the fear of death, something more like a reorientation, a sense that what waited in Hades' kingdom was not simply an ending, that the boundary between life and death was not as absolute or as final as daily life suggested, that there was something in the initiate, some essential part, that the underworld received differently than it received the uninitiated. The Orphic tradition, named for Orpheus, developed a theology of death and afterlife that was more elaborate and more explicitly concerned with the fate of the individual soul than almost anything else in the ancient Greek world. The Orphics believed in the transmigration of souls. The idea that the soul does not simply arrive in Hades and remain, but cycles through multiple lives, returning to the world above in a new body, descending again at death, and gradually, across many incarnations, purifying itself towards something higher. What the Orphic tradition added to the mythology of Hades was a new kind of urgency. If the soul cycled through multiple existences, then how one lived, and how one prepared for death, had consequences extending beyond a single lifetime. The Orphics produced what are known as the Orphic gold tablets, thin sheets of gold inscribed with instructions for the soul after death, buried with the deceased as a kind of guide through the underworld. These tablets, discovered by archaeologists across the ancient Greek world, are among the most direct evidence we have of what actual individuals believed, privately and practically, about what happened after they died. The instructions they contain are remarkably specific. They tell the soul which paths to take at the crossroads of the underworld. They warn against drinking from the Lethe and instruct the soul instead to seek a spring of cool water beside a white cypress tree, which is the spring of memory, and to drink from that instead. They provide the soul with things to say to the guardians of the underworld, essentially passwords and declarations of identity that would establish the soul's initiated status. They addressed Persephone directly, calling her by name, asking for her mercy and her recognition. These were not mythological abstractions. These were practical documents, placed in the hands of the dead because the living believed they would be needed. Running alongside the mystery traditions was Greek philosophy, and the philosophers had a great deal to say about Hades, death, and the soul. Plato engaged most deeply and most systematically with these questions, using the mythology of the underworld as a framework through which difficult truths might become more approachable. In the Phaedo, written as an account of Socrates' final hours before his execution, Plato has Socrates speak with remarkable composure about death, a composure so genuine that it unsettles his friends far more than grief would have. Socrates argues that the philosopher, by training throughout life to separate the soul from the distractions of the body, to prioritize the invisible and the permanent over the visible and the temporary, has in a sense been practicing for death all along. The philosopher's life, properly lived, is a long preparation for exactly what is coming. The prospect does not frighten him because he has already been, in the ways that matter, going there. In the Republic, Plato includes the myth of the account of a soldier who dies in battle, spends 12 days among the dead, and is sent back to report what he has seen. What describes is a judgment system and a reincarnation cycle that draws on both the traditional mythology of Hades and the Orphic doctrine of transmigration, and adds a new element. The souls, before returning to new lives, are given a choice of what kind of life to enter. The choice is made in accordance with the wisdom or foolishness the soul has accumulated. Those who lived well and thought carefully choose wisely. Those who lived for pleasure and avoided reflection tend to choose badly, drawn by the appearance of a life without considering its deeper nature. The underworld, in this vision, is not a terminus. It is a school. What is striking, when you stand back and look at all of this together, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphic tablets, the Platonic dialogues, is how much serious thought, genuine feeling and careful attention the ancient world directed toward the question of death and what came after. These were not peripheral concerns. They were central. They occupied some of the finest minds in antiquity for centuries. They drew hundreds of thousands of ordinary people to undergo ritual initiation at Eleusis, generation after generation, because something in the experience was worth the journey. And at the center of all of it, behind the myths, beneath the philosophy, somewhere inside the sealed initiation hall at Eleusis, on that September night was the kingdom of Hades. The place every soul was going. The place that, if you were wise or lucky or well prepared, held something other than what you feared. The ancient world sat with the question of death, openly, seriously, without rushing to resolve it or dismiss it. They built an entire kingdom around it. They gave it a king. They imagined it in full detail, with rivers and judges and fields and a palace at the center. And in doing so, they made death, if not less frightening, then at least less formless. Less like a void and more like a country. A country with rules, with a ruler, with, if the mysteries were to be believed, something that might be called hope. Every god eventually outlives the civilization that created him. The temples fall, the festivals cease, the priests disperse, and the particular form of worship that sustained the deity dissolves into history. But the god himself, the idea of the god, the accumulated weight of stories and images and meanings that gathered around the name over centuries, does not simply vanish. It travels. It changes shape. It gets absorbed into new traditions, renamed, reinterpreted, sometimes misread so thoroughly that the original is barely recognizable but never fully erased. The idea persists because the need persists. And in the case of Hades, the need was as fundamental as any human need has ever been. The need to make sense of death. The Romans were extraordinarily practical people, and their approach to the Greek gods reflected this. When Rome encountered the Greek pantheon, it did not simply adopt the Greek gods wholesale. It translated them. It found equivalents within the existing Roman religious tradition, merged them with the Greek figures where the overlap was sufficient, and produced a hybrid that served Roman purposes while carrying Greek material forward. For Hades, the translation was more complicated and more consequential than it was for most gods. The Romans had a figure called Dispater, an ancient deity of the underworld and of subterranean wealth, whose name meant simply father of riches. They also had Orcus, a more straightforwardly fearsome figure associated with death and the punishment of broken oaths. When the Romans encountered the Greek Hades in his full complexity, they merged all of these figures together under the name that has proved most durable: Pluto. Pluto carried forward much of what Hades had been: the wealth, the darkness, the absolute authority over the dead, the queen Proserpina beside him, the Roman name for Persephone, whose story the Romans absorbed, almost unchanged, because it was too beautiful and too agriculturally significant to set aside. Under Pluto, the underworld retained its essential structure. The rivers remained, the judges remained, the separation between Elysium and Tartarus remained. The Romans were good administrators, and the Roman underworld was, if anything, more orderly than the Greek one, more legalistic, more precise in its categories of reward and punishment, more closely reflecting the Roman preoccupation with law and civic order. Virgil's Aeneid, written in the 1st century BCE, contains one of the most elaborate and influential descriptions of the underworld in all of ancient literature. In the 6th book, the hero Aeneas descends into the underworld, guided by the Sibyl of Cumae, in a journey that draws deeply on Homer's Nicaea, but expands it into something far more architecturally detailed and morally explicit. Virgil's underworld became, for the Latin-reading world of the next 15 centuries, the primary reference point for what death's kingdom looked like. When medieval scholars and theologians wanted an authoritative classical description of the afterlife, they went to Virgil. And Virgil, magnificent poet that he was, had built his underworld on Greek foundations, carrying Hades forward into a tradition that would endure long after Rome itself had dissolved. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became its official religion, the old gods did not disappear overnight. They faded gradually, unevenly, differently in different places. Some were quietly absorbed into the new tradition as saints or folk figures. Some were recast as demons. Some were simply forgotten. And some were actively reinterpreted in ways that serve the theological needs of the new order. Hades occupied a uniquely uncomfortable position in this transition because Christianity had a deep and serious concern with what happened after death. It had its own underworld, or rather, its own set of afterlife destinations, which mapped onto the Greek framework in ways that were sometimes close and sometimes significantly different. Heaven and hell, and, in Catholic tradition, purgatory each carried echoes of Elysium, Tartarus, and the intermediate spaces of Asphodel. The river of death, the judgment of souls, the separation of the virtuous from the wicked. All of these structural elements survived the transition in recognizable form. What did not survive intact was the figure of the ruler. The Christian hell needed a ruler too, and the ruler it had, Satan, the fallen angel, the adversary, was a figure of a completely different moral character than Hades had been. Satan was evil. He was the source of corruption and temptation. He was not a just sovereign administering a necessary function, but an active force of malice working against the good of humanity. He was everything Hades was not. And yet, because they occupied the same conceptual space, the ruler of the realm beneath, the figure associated with darkness and death and the underground, the two became entangled in the popular imagination. Artists drawing on classical iconography to depict Satan reach for the imagery of Pluto, the dark throne, the three-headed dog, the underworld geography, and in the process, Pluto's visual tradition was gradually overtaken by Satan's moral content. The result, over centuries, was a figure who looked increasingly like a god, but behaved increasingly like a devil. A conflation that served neither tradition accurately, but proved remarkably persistent. By the medieval period, the Hades of Greek mythology was barely visible beneath the accumulated layers of Christian reinterpretation. He had become, in the popular imagination of the Latin West, something very close to a demon lord. The nuance had been smoothed away. The justice had been forgotten. The weeping at Orpheus's music, the faithful devotion to Persephone, the quiet dignity of a king who simply did his job, all of it had been buried under a tradition that needed its underworld ruler to be a villain. The recovery began, slowly and unevenly, with the Renaissance. When 15th and 16th century scholars and artists turned their attention back to the original Greek and Roman sources, they found a Hades considerably more complex than the one they had inherited. The Platonic dialogues presented the underworld as a place of philosophical significance. The mythological handbooks that Renaissance scholars produced attempted to give Hades back some of his original complexity, to distinguish him from the Christian devil with whom he had been so thoroughly conflated. Artists responded. The Renaissance produced extraordinary visual treatments of the Persephone myth. Bernini's sculpture of Pluto and Proserpina, carved in marble in the early 17th century, is perhaps the most technically astonishing rendering of that subject matter in existence. The god's fingers pressing into the goddess's thigh in marble that somehow communicates the softness of skin, her face turned away in genuine distress. It is not a comfortable image, but it is a fully human one. A god who wants something and reaches for it, and a woman who resists, and between them the full, complicated weight of a myth that was never simply about villainy. Opera found in the Orpheus myth, an inexhaustible source of material. Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, premiered in 1607, was among the very first operas composed, and it placed the descent into the underworld at the center of its drama. The scene in which Orpheus pleads with Pluto and Proserpina proved so dramatically potent that composers returned to it again and again across the following centuries. In each retelling, Pluto was required to feel something, required to be moved, required to be a figure capable of compassion rather than merely one capable of punishment. This insistence on the god's emotional depth was the beginning of the rehabilitation. The 20th century brought him into new forms with new velocities. Freud borrowed the name of Thanatos for the death drive, reaching, as so many thinkers had before him, for Greek mythology to describe the deep structures of inner experience. The underworld, in the psychoanalytic tradition, became a metaphor for the unconscious itself. That vast, dark region beneath the functioning surface of the mind, where things were held that could not be easily retrieved, where old material accumulated, where the judges of conscience did their quiet work. Carl Jung deepened this reading. The catabasis, the hero's descent into the underworld, became, in Jungian psychology, the archetype of the descent into the unconscious, the necessary confrontation with the shadow self, the facing of what has been denied or buried. Every time a person goes into therapy, in some sense, they're performing a catabasis. They are descending into their own underworld, moving through their own asphodel, and hoping, if the work goes well, to return with something clarified. The god of the underworld has remained extraordinarily present through film, literature, music, and the visual arts across the entire span of modern culture. He has been a villain, a romantic lead, a philosophical puzzle, a comic figure, and occasionally, in the most thoughtful treatments, something close to what he actually was, a ruler of vast authority and genuine moral seriousness, doing a job that no one else wanted, and doing it with a dignity that has outlasted the civilization that first imagined him. There is a particular quality to the end of a long journey that has nothing to do with arrival. It is something quieter than that, a kind of settling, a drawing together of everything the journey has shown you, a moment where you stop moving forward and simply stand still long enough to let the full shape of what you have traveled through become visible. We have traveled a considerable distance. We descended through the architecture of a kingdom built from rivers and shadow and the careful geography of moral consequence. We sat with a god of extraordinary complexity and watched him be misread, reduced, recovered, and misread again across 25 centuries of human history. We followed the living who dared to enter his domain and observed what they found there and what it cost them. We stood at the edges of the great mystery traditions and felt the weight of what they were attempting. We watched Hades travel through Rome and the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the modern world, changing shape with each new context but never quite disappearing. And now we arrive here, at the end, which is, perhaps, the most appropriate place in which to think about Hades. The reason Hades endures is not because death is interesting. Death, in the abstract, is not interesting. It is simply inevitable. What makes Hades endure? What makes him matter still to people reading about him thousands of years after the last Greek worshipper pressed a coin into the mouth of their dead, is that he is the mythological form of a question we have never stopped asking. And the way the Greeks shaped that question, through his character and his kingdom and his mythology, remains one of the most honest and most human attempts in all of recorded history to look at mortality without flinching. Other traditions have answered the question of death with certainty, with a confident architecture of paradise and punishment, with the assurance of resurrection, with the doctrine of release from the cycle of rebirth into something beyond all cycles. These answers have sustained billions of people across thousands of years, and they are not to be dismissed lightly. But the Greek tradition, and Hades within it, offered something different, not certainty, something closer to honesty about the limits of what can be known, combined with a determination to imagine the unknown as carefully and as completely as possible. In building that specificity, those rivers, those judges, those regions of reward and consequence, the Greeks were doing something profound. They were asserting that death was not chaos, that it was not meaninglessness, that whatever waited on the other side of existence was orderly, was governed by principles recognizable as just, and was presided over by a figure who, whatever else might be said of him, took his responsibilities seriously. Hades himself, as a figure, carries within him a kind of message that only becomes fully visible when you have spent sufficient time with him. It is not a message that announces itself. It does not arrive with drama or instruction. It is simply there, in the pattern of his behavior across every myth and tradition that touches him. The message is this: some things cannot be negotiated away, but they can be faced with dignity. Hades did not choose his role. He drew the short lot. The division of the cosmos between the three brothers was decided by chance, and the darkest portion fell to him. He could have resented this. He could have spent eternity in the posture of the wronged brother, nursing grievance against Zeus, who received the sky, and Poseidon, who received the sea, while he descended alone into the permanent dark. The Greek tradition is full of gods and heroes who were given unwanted fates and responded with rage or resentment or endless attempts to escape. Hades did not respond that way. He went to his kingdom and he governed it. He built something in the dark. He administered a realm of incomprehensible scale, every soul that had ever lived, arriving in an endless stream that had been flowing since the first human being drew breath and would continue flowing until the last one did. And he did it with consistency and with justice, and in the company of Persephone, with something that looked, across the centuries, very much like contentment. There is a particular kind of maturity in that, a recognition that the question is not always whether the assignment you have been given is the one you would have chosen, but whether you can find the dignity in doing it well. Hades found it. There is also, in Hades, something to be said about the relationship between power and restraint. He was among the most powerful beings in the Greek cosmos. His authority was absolute within his kingdom in a way that Zeus's authority on Olympus never quite was. And yet he did not use this power expansively. He did not reach up into the living world and take. He did not meddle in mortal affairs for amusement. He waited for what was his by the natural order of things, and it always came. Every soul, in time, arrived at his shore. Every life, however long or powerful or seemingly above ordinary consequence, eventually crossed the Styx. He needed no army, no campaign, no strategy of acquisition. He simply maintained the kingdom, and the kingdom filled itself. This is power exercised with a patience so complete it becomes almost invisible. And it is, in its way, the most absolute power of all. Not the power of the conqueror who takes what he wants when he wants it, but the power of the principle that everything, in the end, comes to the same place. What does it mean then to sit with all of this in the present moment? Perhaps it means this: the old God still has something to offer. Not as a literal theological proposition, but as a way of thinking about mortality, as an imaginative framework for engaging with the fact of death without being destroyed by it. The Hades tradition remains remarkably useful. Its insistence on fairness, on the idea that the life you lived will be seen whole and judged honestly, without the distortions of wealth or status that so often corrupt justice in the living world, speaks to something deep in human moral intuition. We want to believe, even when the evidence of daily life suggests otherwise, that how we actually lived will ultimately matter, that the kindnesses done in private will be seen, that the cruelties committed in secret will be accounted for. Its insistence on the equality of the dead, the king and the beggar arriving at the same shore, crossing the same river, submitting to the same judgment, speaks to something equally deep. The great leveling that death performs is one of the few genuinely universal experiences in human existence, and Hades presides over it without playing favorites. His kingdom is the one place in the Greek cosmos where the greatest warrior does not get better treatment than the farmer who never fought in any war, and simply lived, quietly and ordinarily, for the allotted years. We should say something, at the end, about the god himself one final time. Not as a mythology or a history or a philosophical framework, just as the figure he is, standing at the center of everything we have explored, patient and permanent and still. He is the God who took the darkness and built something in it, who received the unwanted portion of existence and administered it with more genuine justice than most of the gods who received the better lots, who loved one person with a faithfulness unusual among gods or mortals, who wept at beautiful music, who let heroes go when they asked correctly, and held them when they asked arrogantly, and maintained throughout it all a consistency of character that is, in the long gallery of mythological figures, genuinely rare. He is the God whose name people were afraid to say, and who turned out, on closer examination, to be less frightening than almost any other major figure in the Greek pantheon, not because he was soft, not because his domain was pleasant for everyone within it, but because he was fair. And in a cosmos as turbulent and capricious and often cruel as the one the Greeks imagined, fairness was not a small thing. It was, in fact, one of the greatest things. He sits in his palace beneath the world as he has always sat. The rivers run their ancient courses around him. Cerberus keeps his post at the gate. The judges review the souls that arrive in their endless stream. Persephone moves between our two worlds. And when she descends to him, the ground above grows cold. And when she returns, it blooms. And the rhythm of that movement is the rhythm of the seasons, is the rhythm of agriculture, is the rhythm of life itself insisting on its cycle. And Hades waits, not impatiently, not with longing for something else. He waits the way a mountain waits, not because it lacks the power to move, but because it has found, in stillness, exactly where it is supposed to be. Every life that has ever been lived has gone to him, eventually. Every grief has quieted in his kingdom. Every ambition and every fear and every love and every regret has crossed those rivers and arrived on those shores and been received, without judgment for its smallness, without awe for its greatness, simply received and held in that vast and permanent dark. There is something in that which is not frightening at all. There is something in that which is almost like rest.